So welcome everyone to this session about preparing for first operations. I am Paola Libraro, work with Ernst & Young, really part of their aerospace, defense, and mobility group as part of the consulting practice. And I work on advanced air mobility across the commercial and public sectors. I've been in the sector now for focusing on this specific topic for quite a few years, and I'm excited to have a great set of panelists here and experts jump into the session. So maybe I'll give everyone just a couple of minutes to introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into the questions.
Awesome, thank you. My name is Philip Brady. I work for Skyports Infrastructure. We're based out of London. We develop vertiport infrastructure for advanced air mobility vehicles. I focus on acquisitions and partnerships in the United States, and I'm very excited to be here.
So Eric Krona, I work at Wisk, just a few miles south of this location. Wisk is developing a remotely supervised, highly autonomous aircraft that aims to enter operations before the end of the decade to serve as an urban air taxi. My role in the company is dealing with ConOps, airspace integration, operational testing activities, and helping define how do we enter operations with this vehicle. So thank you for having us.
Corey Cousins, I'm the founder of Altoport. We're developing automation systems for GA airports today with an eye towards vertiport automation. And our work is based on some of the stuff that I've done in the past. I'm one of the founders of Surf Air, which runs 135 operations all around the country. Spent some time with Airbus running on-demand helicopter service here in the Bay Area as well, with some pretty critical learnings that I think are informative to at least my opinions on what first operations will look like.
Great, thanks. Chris Rushlow, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National Business Aviation Association. Part of my responsibility is our Advanced Air Mobility Roundtable, as well as operations and some other business operations aspects for the association. But I come 2 years ago, I was at the FAA, retired after 22 years. I was the former aviation safety and certification chief before coming there, and obviously spent some time at the agency as a regulator, so I hope to bring some of that perspective to the conversation today as well.
Thank you. So this session is about preparing for first operations. So I would like to start by asking our panelists, what do we mean by first operations? Or in other words, how do we expect advanced air mobility to look like on day one? What could be potential use cases? And when can we expect all of these to happen?
So from a Skyports infrastructure standpoint, day one for us is really going to be determined and led by our operating partners, right? Because we make our money from landing fees. So right now we're seeing most of our main OEM operating partners looking at the passenger transportation kind of business model. You know, personally, I'm really focused on South Florida and kind of the broader state of Florida. And I tell people, you know, 3 vehicles in the air on day one is success because it allows for kind of a slow ramp up, consumer buy-in. And for those who know about launching new aircraft, you know, you can't just launch an aircraft and open a market with 5 operating vehicles. I think it's something like 3 to 1 is typically the ratio. So I think slow is better. I'll let you take it from there.
I'll actually be the guy on the stage to say I think the term first operations is a bit of a misnomer and a dangerous misnomer. It ignores operations, very similar operations that have happened in the past. 60 years ago, there were as many as 360,000 passengers flying via helicopter around the Bay Area. As many as 20 flights a day between the Pan Am building and JFK. So first operations have kind of happened already. You know, as recently as 3 years ago, Airbus and their subsidiary Voom was flying on-demand helicopter service roughly on the route that Archer had up here earlier. And I guess I'm making a little bit of a stink about that because I think ignoring what's happened in the past gives us this dangerous opportunity to just kind of imagine first operations however we want to, without learning from the realities of what's been done in the past, what's worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past. And so really when I think about first operations, I think a healthy framework is a disruption framework. Where are similar operations happening today where the vehicle in use is overpowered, right? A Bell helicopter that can fly for 5 or 6 hours, but it's doing 15-minute circles around New York City with tourists, or 15-minute flights between Wall Street and JFK or whatever it might be, right? I think that disruption framework is critical as we're thinking about first operations. Where does VTOL already work today, where these vehicles can come in and while they may not have the same capacity that a helicopter has, they can come in and meet those mission needs. That's probably where we're going to see true first operations.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on that. I like the way you framed it. So when you think about first day operations or day one operations, I like to think we've already started that. When we look back a few years ago, we see how we've brought in new technologies into the National Airspace System. We talk about companies like Zipline and Wing and Matternet who are doing deliveries today, right? We see with the test trials that are going on in Dallas right now with respect to airspace. Then you look at advanced propulsion, electric. We're talking about hydrogen already. So you see some of that coming into the market already. That, to me, is kind of day one on advanced air mobility. Now, when we talk about use cases for eVTOLs, that's where I think we get into, and you heard a little bit of that this morning as well, where you start talking about public use, right? Well, certainly the military is heavily invested in this and doing some wonderful work that's generating data and applications for it. But then you think about law enforcement, you think about emergency medical services, you think about some of the firefighting things that people are working on right now. I think that really looks at day one. Then you move into cargo operations, regional cargo operations. You've got companies out there like Beta that are working on it. I know Revolution.Aero this morning was talking about some of the work they're doing. That kind of brings you into, let's say, day two or later on into day one, if you will. And then, of course, you get into what we talk about with respect to passenger operations, and I think that's one of the reasons why NBA has kind of seized upon this to make sure that when we think about the application of these eVTOL aircraft, like general aviation and business aviation in general, moving into commercial, it starts in that area where you find the premium customers, right? So the heliport to JFK and some of those applications. I think we're going to see more of that on, quote, day one than you will kind of the mass movement of taxi services, air taxi services that we've talked about kind of off and on over the years.
Rob Weisenthal, I don't know if I'm looking for him out in the crowd. I haven't seen him yet, but Blade has been operating flights in New York area and other places for about a decade. And my guess is that, I don't have these numbers for certain, but I'm guessing 90% of their operations could be done by an eVTOL today if there was charging and infrastructure in place.
The key thing we're not talking about in the panel purpose of this panel is to discuss this is infrastructure. These need a lot of power. Power is expensive. Our utility grid is outdated. The built environment in America and every city is different and largely obsolete. So we're going through this kind of repositioning of urban environments. And I think even though there may be a really strong use case in certain communities for emergency, passenger cargo, if the infrastructure is not built and built at a price point that supports the ultimate operator's business model, we won't see that. And that's something that I'm excited to get a little bit into more later on.
So as the OEM who obviously depends on vertiport infrastructure, I think, when we look at what we're doing at Wisk and look at what other OEMs are doing, it is very clear that the value proposition, aka price point, and the ability to design a system that scales is really important. I asked if I could show a couple of slides. And the reason for that is, as the remotely supervised OEM, right? Bumper sticker is autonomous flight. Typically, these operations are placed sometime very far in the future. And so when the topic of this is initial operations, I wanted to share that initial operations is a spectrum, as was already mentioned, but it's a spectrum that is constrained by the current capabilities of the airspace, right? So whatever the airspace can support will be the spectrum of operations that we will see. We will see the zip lines, we will see the reliable robotics, we will see other urban air taxi operators, and you will see vehicles like the one that's on the screen that WISC is looking to, actually making composites as we speak and in the process of certifying. Now, when we think about what this operation looks like, if we want to go to the next slide, please. This is our pilot stations, right? This is my idea of a good time, by the way. And so we're thinking about, when we think about why autonomy, it's because we have a convergence of information, we have a convergence of compute, and we have a convergence of manufacturing methods and a market that would allow us to deploy these services safely. Again, WISC is certifying to 10 to the minus 9, right? Airline levels of safety, and then bring these services to the market. And to the point of building out infrastructure, there's tremendous synergistic effects in that if we're able to reduce the price point, the value is there. And there was a comment, if we want to go to the next slide, please. And there was a comment this morning that talked about how do we increase the capabilities of the NAS? That is true. But we also need to be able to demonstrate the capabilities in the current NAS. That's just a reality. So this document, I provide a QR code, is what we are currently working with the FAA on demonstrating what operations in today's NAS look like for remotely supervised operations. IFR expanded, right? So we're following IFR operations. We have onboard detect and avoid capabilities. And key point is no changes to the current NAS. And so the challenge is, again, I'll end by saying initial operations will be determined by what the NAS can absorb. We are architecting these systems, we're thinking about vertiports, and we're thinking about the true value proposition of what happens after day one operations.
We'll get back to the autonomy topic in a second, but before we do that, we've got an idea of what do we call first operations and what the timeline is for that. But what do we think are the major challenges there? We've heard a lot also from previous sessions, so I would like to get your thoughts about that as well. What are the major roadblocks ahead?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one because when you think about all the things we've talked about so far, some of the major challenges really in kind of enabling beyond day one is what the NAS, what the National Airspace System can actually absorb. And that includes the electrification, right, the infrastructure there. But I think of it, I kind of bucket it in three areas. First, there's the regulatory piece. So we saw just a few weeks ago at the NBA conference, the administrator of the FAA signed this special federal aviation rule, the SFAR, that will enable operations for these vehicles. It was a very exciting day, and it's a very exciting kind of transition to what is next, in addition to the certification of the aircraft. So I think the regulatory piece, and we're talking about that both kind of with respect to aircraft certification, operations, and then, of course, the airspace piece of this, because the airspace piece of this is huge. And if you've heard the FAA talk about this in the past, and even as recently as maybe a couple months ago, they're operating 3 different national airspace systems as we speak. They've got the legacy one that we talked about this morning, the 50s and the 60s and the technology. You've got that piece. You've got what is in place now, that they're using regularly with respect to GPS and ADS-B, which is great. That's actually adding a lot of safety and efficiency to the airspace system. But then you're working on what tomorrow looks like. And when you think about the FAA's ConOps, the NASA's ConOps, kind of a sky for all, when you start thinking about these things, it really will take kind of that infrastructure, that regulatory framework to be able to enable the operations. The second piece is infrastructure. And so, again, that bleeds over into the airspace piece what you've got on the ground, what you connect to the space. So infrastructure is a big challenge or something to tackle. And then finally, public perception. I mean, having worked intimately to introduce drones into the National Airspace System for a few years, they can fly and they are safe, but when someone sees it over their house or their homeowners association knows that you're going to be kind of operating, even if they're quiet, that public perception piece is critical. So the acceptance of it is going to be very important for operations and the regulator to work with the OEMs and obviously the vertiports as well.
Chris, do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yeah,
So we talk about the NAS, and there's a lot of work to be done for WISC, which is autonomous. But for true day one, visual flight rules, blades operating in the congested New York, Manhattan area. Miami-Dade County has Class B. There's plenty of, there's plenty of agreements in place across Class B airspace that allow for visual flight. So do you think we have an issue with the NAS for day one, true day one operation?
No, I think if you were to talk to the FAA people that run the NAS today, they tell you they're ready to kind of take them in the air. If they're certified and they follow the SFAR operational rules, they're ready to go.
Good to go, right? So then it gets back to the importance of real estate. And on that, I'll let Corey.
Location, 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 right? My real estate buddy on the other end of the bench
That's
here.
the value prop.
And I think, let's combine that, right? First day with a true value prop. We flew however many helicopters around San Francisco. They're flying around New York. It can be done in the airspace. Really what kills the first day operations is location. And there's two aspects to that. One is the infrastructure. What infrastructure are you working with? We flew in and out of Palo Alto. Coincidentally, the private or the public terminal that's there today is the same public terminal that was built 60 years ago for that helicopter airline I mentioned previously. Exact same infrastructure is still there. And then, of course, you need to be able to charge these aircraft, et cetera. So there's the functional infrastructure, but then the other value component is location. It turns out that a multimodal travel ribbon is not that exciting. It kills the time savings. When you've got to be to the vertiport 10 minutes in advance of your flight to make sure you don't miss it, and you've got the frustration and fluster of having to line up a Uber to your eVTOL ride and all of that, it kills the value proposition really quickly. So looking at that Archer map, the most popular route that we ran on with that local helicopter service here was actually Palo Alto to Napa, for obvious reasons, right? But we did the math left, right, up, and down. We could get folks to fly with us 1 or 2 times because it was a novelty, it was exciting. After 1 or 2 flights, they said, hey, I could have just sat in an Uber, from point A to point B, gotten the whole trip in one vehicle, taken phone calls the whole way, no concerns at all, done it on a completely flexible schedule. Yes, that was fun doing it in a helicopter, but I'm good for now, thanks. So location, location, location. Invest in skyports because they're buying up those locations. I wasn't paid to say that, but really that's what's going to allow for value on day one is when you do have meaningful locations to fly in and out of that are close to your true destination and origin.
So completely agree with everything that has been said. So I'll go and talk about the main challenge that WISC has faced, and that is demystifying autonomy. Just show of hands, how many came to the conference and have already ridden a Waymo? Okay, you're missing out. It's really cool. But unlike the Waymos of the world, the WISC does not have AI ML capabilities, right? We know that AI and ML is not at a state where it can be certified. And so in the Cognos, when we think about autonomy in today's world, it's immediately linked to AI ML. And so perception is we do not have AI ML in our system. Number 2 is we still have human supervision involved, meaning, yes, the aircraft has increased levels of automation. I'm going with what the control engineers' terminology is, right? But we do have the human element that is able to engage if when necessary. And lastly is the perception that, well, these aircraft, they must require segregated airspace. They must. And the reality is, and this is why we published the ConOps and made it very public, is, and think about it differently, why would we as a nascent industry create a barrier to entry that would require segregated airspace? And so we're engineering and architecting the system for full integration, right? So when we think about all of those things, it's stakeholder perception. That includes the flying passenger, that includes the communities, that includes the regulators. It also includes the infrastructure guys and gals, because we need to be able to work with them, and they need to understand what our operations are and that we're credible. So I think that's, demystifying autonomy has been really important for us, and being very transparent about what we mean by what it is.
So since we are on the autonomy topic, and the next session is also going to be very focused on autonomy, maybe let's try to get some more thoughts, hear some more thoughts from our experts. What do we think about the role that autonomy is going to play on day one? And we know that stakeholders have had very different reactions to that, from, okay, autonomy is something that's happening in the long term versus it should be part of day one. What do we think as a panel here?
I mean, WISC isn't planning to certify till 2030, so, right?
A little sooner, but...
A little sooner,
well,
but large
just,
operation. So, yeah, so they won't, no one will be around for day one operations. It's strictly VFR, but maybe Chris has...
Well, the only thing I would say there is, again, going back to kind of how I started, there are a number of operators out there that are working with advanced air mobility, again, in kind of a more generic sense, that are using AI and ML. And now some, as accurately described earlier, they don't want to go kind of all in at this point simply because of that FAA certification process, which is very challenging, no doubt about it, and limited expertise within the agency itself to be able to kind of certify some of these. However, AI is definitely playing an important part in informing and actually operationalizing some of the operations I think we're going to see on day one. But to a true kind of let the AI do it, probably not.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to put myself in the airspace side of the house. AI technology today provides great recommendations as a recommendation engine. When you think about workload, and this is not me saying it, this is European and US research saying it, AI can apply very nicely as a recommendation engine for air traffic control problems, right? Now that goes to outside the realm of how do we operate in today's NAS. These tools, right? And the key is if you can apply AI, ML in a recommendation fashion such that there's a human element in the loop, meaning this is not the T-1000 that goes rogue, right? It becomes much easier for this technology to you might not even fall under a certification wormhole. So is there a role for AI, ML technologies? Absolutely. Will these technologies come to a point where they surpass the threshold of certification? We're seeing that in some of the healthcare solutions, right? So I think the answer is yes, but not today.
Okay. Before we end the session, there is also another topic I would like to touch on. So far, we've been talking mostly about the United States, and I know also in other sessions we have referenced a little bit what's going on around the world. What is your idea in terms of either lessons learned, things that could be an inspiration versus things to avoid when looking at other areas in the world and how AAM is being treated?
Well, I'll take that and run with it. In 2019, we built the first vertiport prototype globally with Volocopter in Singapore. We were provided raw land in Marina Bay that had a value of about $1 billion. We were not the highest and best use, but the government wanted to explore advanced air mobility and therefore helped open up the market for us there. Today we are building in Dubai. We broke ground at the airport last month, and we are receiving support from a utility perspective from the Dubai Emirate. We do a lot of work with NEOM. Our investor group ADP took a shot at getting AAM up and running for the Olympics. And in all of those cases, or whether it's projects we're working on in the UK where we're based, the government is coming to the table and helping subsidize our construction, our land costs, whatnot, in some way, shape, or form. The United States has not done a good enough job doing that. Build Back Better has a tremendous amount of money out there, but a lot of those grants are read by highway folks, so it's a little harder to go after. What I would say I've learned from my colleagues internationally is, at the end of the day, this is a grassroots initiative. And so I take a very anthropological look. I put myself in the shoes of the political folks and the public folks in the communities where we're trying to build. Every built environment is different, so there's no one-stop shop solution. And so I think, and back to what is going to be the first type of operation, it really depends. It really depends on the needs of the local community at that time. What's going on from a redevelopment standpoint? What's the political environment look like? What's the utility environment look like? So don't think that you can slap a sticker on a community and just launch. It's far more complex and nuanced. So,
if I could add one thing, when you talk about the international piece, and I will be very open and say that there's real concern about kind of U.S. leadership in this space right now, whether it's on the infrastructure side of it or the certification side or the operational side. When you think about FAA and EASA and how they've been working things, and you see what's going on in the Middle East and Asia. So U.S. leadership is particularly important in this area, and so we'll have to see what 2025 will bring to that conversation. But I'll say again, as a regulator, former regulator, the data that is being generated, what the lessons learned that are happening in some of the locations that we're talking about is going to be invaluable to kind of propelling that here in the United States as things kind of take hold, as it builds momentum. I agree that it really comes down to kind of where and what you want to do with these aircraft, but the safety data that will be so critical to kind of proving the concepts and making sure they're enabled, advancing kind of way past day one to year one, I think we're going to learn a lot from those collaborations overseas.
So since you asked the question, the hamster has been going on. What have we learned? What have we learned? What have we learned? And I would say I kept going back to the automotive world, where it was a grassroots effort, where chargers were one company. And we live in a world of standards. We also live in a world where we know that battery technologies are going to evolve. And I use that example because I think OEMs recognize that, first, we don't compete on safety. Second of all, we should not compete on infrastructure and CNS. And so one of the documents, if you haven't read it already, is a document that was published by Gamma that provided a position on what is the CNS that is required to support these types of operations, not only in today's NAS. And it clarifies, we will take the NAS as it is. but where can we go forward? And if I could go back in time and be able to accelerate that conversation, I think it would place us as a nation a bit ahead. Because a lot of the coordination with the OEMs, I think, took quite some time to get there.
Perfect, thank you. I see there are also some questions from the audience, so maybe we'll try to take a few. I see one about the autonomy of ground vehicles in the future, and if there is, any impact that we can foresee for the AM solution. Convenience, cost, privacy. Any thoughts from our panelists about that? How, integrating the two could look like?
Well, I mean, what we're talking here is the first and last mile of the passenger journey. So design of the vertiport, selection of the site is super important. Traffic studies, making sure egress and whatnot to and from the site is there. Just traditional kind of development 101. AAM will never replace trains, planes, and automobiles. We will be another modality option. Even the most robust downtown vertiport with a FATO and 3 or 4 gates, you're moving 40 to 60 people an hour. So I think multimodal is important. Yes, if you're autonomous, you take the driver out, and therefore it will find cost savings. But I don't see that as.
He won't cancel either.
Huh? Anyway, you never know. It might run over a cat and, no offense, Waymo, get caught hitting the horn or something. So I don't think it will have a big impact.
Oh, I see another question.
I have a couple of questions. The first question is, and I'm going to answer the questions myself.
Okay. Turn the mic on.
How many heliports are in New York City, Manhattan? Anybody know?
3.
That's correct. How many are in Sao Paulo?
Heliports or helipads?
Heliports.
Heliports, there's probably 5 helipads. Rooftop, there's several hundred.
Right, several hundred, as opposed to New York 3. Okay. Over 400 helicopters operate in Sao Paulo, and just a handful operate in New York City. So the talk about doing this in that environment is really kind of stretching my concept of believability. Okay. Not only because it's NIMBY stuff, not my backyard, but also because there's an awful lot of stakeholders that don't want it to happen. And you cannot force it to happen. So I think that preparing for first operations, you should be looking at locations where somebody, not the FAA, can unequivocally say, I want this to happen. And that's going to be areas that are controlled by people who can actually make a decision and say, I want this to be the law right now. And it has to be in areas where accessibility is very low, because if you're looking at going from downtown to Kennedy in 7.5 minutes and the cost is $300, yes, what you're going to see is the uber wealthy are able to do that, but you're not solving anybody else's transportation issues.
From a day one standpoint, I don't think you actually have any disagreement up here. I think there's kind of two mindsets. One is, it's already happening to some extent in New York. We can replace it with a quieter aircraft. Nobody's going to balk at that, right? And then the other camp is, hey, forget New York. Let's go to Florida. Let's build fresh, where we can design this exactly the way we want. I think longer term, absolutely. Are we going to be landing on the top of the Pan Am building anytime soon? Probably not, right? So longer term, I absolutely agree with you that we've got to look at locations where they're a little bit more friendly. But there's already helicopters flying in New York.
And I'll just say first and foremost, you're right. NIMBYism is a big component to getting permits and approvals. There are going to be cities and communities that just don't want it, and that's fine. That's their decision. It's a beautiful part about this country. I'll also say, and my OEM operators, might take me out back and beat me up, but there's a false narrative that this is going to be affordable. day one. I mean, if truly ever. I mean, you're going to need third, fourth, fifth generation aircraft. You're going to be needing to pay all the investors back. I mean, how many people could afford an iPhone on day one? How many families had a desktop in the 90s, right? I mean, now everyone's got a desktop, a cell phone, and an iPad, if not multiple. So this will take time to get that price point down. Will it ever be an Uber X? I don't know. I don't think so, but I hope to be wrong.
So from an OEM I think community engagement is really important. And along those lines, noise is really important. There's a reason why OEMs bolster their noise signatures. Where's Joby when you need them? If Joby's in the room, but Joby just flew New York. I didn't hear it from Joby. I heard it from the folks that witnessed the flight. And
What's the price of a Joby aircraft?
I'm getting at noise. If you find out the price of I'd love it as a competitor, by the way. But the entry point, I think, is this is where OEMs and the infrastructure at large has to demonstrate value, because the price point will come down as we demonstrate that value, right? There's a scale effect here that is really important. And so to say New York is not going to be it on day one may be true. There are other locations where we will be able to demonstrate the value, and then we will demonstrate the safety, we will demonstrate the noise signature, and if we're successful, what is right now a push will become a pull. So.
I also want to make sure, since we're almost at time, that we are addressing the other two questions. Anyone from our panelists who is interested in saying something about that? Go ahead.
Quick thoughts on those first two. IFR versus VFR. VFR is actually a real benefit with these sorts of flights. The ability to get into SFO VFR versus IFR, it's actually quite different. But IFR, especially from a regional standpoint, again, looking at that Archer route map, VFR in San Francisco is a nightmare. When I was running that helicopter operation, the first thing I did every morning was wake up and look out the window to see if there was fog, and if I was going to have to tell my team to cancel the 20 flights we had scheduled for that morning. So certainly from a regional standpoint, being able to fly IFR in certain locations is absolutely critical. And then, of course, longer term, when we're talking about autonomy, whatever the equivalent is of IFR is an absolute necessity. I'll comment on VAS quickly here. There's kind of two core components of VAS. One is the aspect that facilitates autonomy, not really necessary on day one because the aircraft aren't going to be autonomous. The other is the functionality that facilitates scheduled usage of a scarce resource. And that's already functional. We ran a proof of concept for that down in Sao Paulo for about a year with a dozen different helipads that, prior to us rolling that out to schedule it, you had to reach out via smoke signals and WhatsApp and whatever else you needed to use to connect with that helipad to schedule it. So we implemented the scheduling, the resource scheduling and management aspect of VAS down there, ran it for a year. So that's operational and ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, I'll say too, on the VFR side, yes, fog is prevalent in San Fran, not so much in Miami. VFR for helicopters in and out of MIA is very straightforward. It actually comes down to a pilot training standpoint. You better be able to communicate confidently with air traffic control. And if you do that, you'll get in and out, relatively with ease. If you don't.
If I may. So the thing with VFR that we forget when we're thinking of MIA and SFO is once you enter that airspace, you're effectively under positive control, just like any other IFR aircraft. It's not necessarily that you will be even allowed to enter unless your letter of agreement is established. So you do have this distinction between VFR and IFR in this types of airspace goes away. IFR gives you the benefit of being resilient to weather. And so saying the ability to meet your departure will not be a function of whether you're IFR or VFR. It'll be a function of how well you designed your route, how well you established your letter of agreement, and how well you manage your operation. And oh, by the way, this is for all of the consultants out there that like to board the airplane as the door is closing. We will obviously not endorse that, right? I mean, you should try to schedule your flights accordingly with some buffer. Rest assured that we're looking at designing a system that is as reliable and predictable as possible.
I know we are at time, so thank you all for joining the session, and thanks to our panelists. Thank you.